Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, July 17th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about Donald Trump's Texas redraw and how it could potentially backfire on the same political party that is hoping to implement it ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. Now, we've seen a lot of conversation in the mainstream media about this Texas redraw. So let me tell you exactly what's going on and what we're likely to see over the coming days and weeks as this special session starts to ramp up and new maps are proposed and potentially voted on for the 2026 midterm elections. Governor Greg Abbott of the state of Texas, the longtime incumbent who's actually planning to run for re-election in the next election cycle, has decided that in a special session in the middle of a decade, that he would be calling for a brand new map to be drawn for the congressional map and the congressional elections in the 2026 midterms. Now, this came after Donald Trump spoke months ago with officials from the Texas Republican delegation and told them that I am worried, I being Trump, he is worried about the 2026 midterm elections and that the Republican Party needed to make sure that Texas was on track to keep Republicans in power as much as possible. And coming off the last election, Texas voted about 25 seats in favor of the Republican Party, in contrast with Democrats at 13. In terms of respective popular vote share, Democrats lost the popular vote by about 18 points, but in terms of overall representation, only have about a third of the seats at large. But the Republican Party very clearly isn't satisfied, not necessarily with their result in Texas, but where they were on the national stage. This is the narrowest majority for any political party that we have seen in this century, and the Republican Party was hoping that they would have a more expansive majority going into an election where Donald Trump won the presidential. But the House obviously didn't go that way. Democrats actually gained seats off the last cycle despite losing the presidential election, and that meant that Republicans were going to be that much more vulnerable in the next cycle. And so Donald Trump knows this. His political team or whoever's advising him on it says that there are opportunities for redraws all across the country, Ohio being one that we knew would come soon. We'll talk about that map once the legislature actually gets through there. But also to Texas, an opportunity that Republicans believe still has more to bleed. And bleed in a way because it's read that this state could be drawn with Donald Trump's directive to have 5 more seats in favor of the Republican Party. And so what this would actually look like is that many of these deep blue pockets that were drawn already to be Democratic gerrymanders, the Republican Party compacted all the Democratic Party voters in this state in just a few districts across the state, you'll find that they will draw them out. And this is not the first time the Texas Republicans have done this. They actually did a mid-decade redistrict back in the 2000 election after they won in the 2002 midterm elections. In the year 2000, Democrats redrew the map after the 2000 census because they maintained control of the Texas legislature. But then 2 years later, under President George W. Bush, who had just won Texas by about 20 points in the last presidential election, the Republican Party was ushered in a new era of Republican leadership across the state to which they looked at this congressional map and said, we don't want this anymore. And it was out of practice at the time, as it is out of practice today. But they got away with it largely because it was only 2 years after the new maps had been drawn. And to be fair to the GOP at the time, the Republicans had been dominating on the presidential level. There was no real reason that Democrats, in theory at least, should be able to be winning the majority of the seats in a state that the Republican presidential candidate is winning by roughly 20 to 23 points. The next cycle in 2004, George W. Bush defeated John Kerry in this state by 23 percentage points. But still, it was out of practice. Very standard and very often, states switch political allegiance, and yet the political party that comes ushered into power does not redraw the map. But Republicans did so. They did so successfully. But they did it in a way that maintained Democrats holding about a third of the seats across the state. It wasn't great for Democrats, and they lost a significant portion of their Texas delegation, but it certainly meant something that they were getting about a third of the state's seats in one of the largest states in the country. And that's what happened again in 2024, roughly the same exact percentage of composition. But again, the Republican Party and Donald Trump are getting greedy in the state of Texas. And they're hoping that drawing 5 more seats away from the Democratic Party could eventually put the Republicans at 30 seats in the Texas delegation, while Democrats have just 8. And so what that would mean is on the national stage, Democrats wouldn't just be competing to win 5 seats to get to where the Republicans are today. You'd need 15 seats. Democrats would be down to 210 and Republicans would be up to 225. It'd be difficult and more difficult than where it is right now, and certainly not impossible, but absolutely adds an additional barrier to entry for Democrats having the Speaker of the House come the next Congress. And like I said, Ohio was also set to redraw too. The Republican and Democrats couldn't agree on a map. So they have a new map that's expected in 2026. And we already know the GOP is planning to reduce the Democratic leadership, the Democratic Congress people, down from 5 seats to 3, if not 2, across this state. And so it'll be very interesting to see how Ohio does their redraw. But again, the odds are being stacked against the Democratic Party ahead of a midterm that everybody, Donald Trump, Mike Johnson, every Republican, every Democrat knows that 2026 will likely be a much better year for Democrats than the 2024 election. And that's what worries them. And so now let's talk about why this might backfire. Hopefully that gives you a general grounding about what we expect from Texas. But in terms of how it would backfire, we have to look no further than what we are already seeing in terms of the state of California and Governor Gavin Newsom's response to Texas. Many members of the California Democratic delegation that serve in U.S. Congress say they're open to the idea of a redraw, even if it means their own Democratic district becomes more competitive, if it means cracking Republican vote share. It's the type of fight fire with fire leadership that Democrats have been longing for across the country. And they're seeing it now with Newsom, who's saying, if Texas redraws, we will too. It'll be difficult. The legal hurdles in California are much more significant than they are in Texas. But Gavin Newsom seems very hell-bent that this is a reality that he is willing to make happen. And many members of the California Democratic delegation also seem to be on board too. The other state that comes into consideration for a redraw is the state of New York, which actually did a redraw earlier on in the last election, but it didn't really do that much in terms of direct benefit. Democrats were largely unaffected and a bit upset with the way the New York map was drawn. But it did help. When you take a look at the results in 2022 versus what they were in 2024, very obviously, the redrawing of the districts boosted Democrats up to 19 seats across the state. But what Democrats are hoping for is that there were some proposals that came forth after the 2020 census that would have made New York State 24-2 in favor of the Democrats, 23-3 in favor of the Democrats. And a little bit of lore here is that Governor Kathy Hochul, who was the person responsible for signing these maps, actually became lieutenant governor before governor simply because the House map was drawn in a way that gerrymandered her out of her own district. So many Democrats were hoping that New York would go for the jugular in terms of redistricting, but it didn't happen. Democrats played it easy and they got shot down, and so you saw that it was 15-11 and ultimately played it easy again, even though they advanced their map here. It doesn't go as far, at least compared to what Texas is trying to do in terms of mass reduction on overall vote share. Democrats would be holding the same amount of seats in Texas, save one, as Republicans do in New York, despite New York being a solid state for the Democratic Party, but also, too, historically speaking, these two states do not have the same population. Texas has been consistently larger than New York, and so it doesn't make sense in terms of actual number of seats that New York that has, less total seats than Republicans are hoping for in terms of total delegation after the redraw. And so there might be some conversation there, but we'll have to wait and see. So on one end, it certainly could backfire, insofar that Democrats across New York and California could say, Texas, you do you, and we'll do us, and we'll redraw our maps too. But let's talk about what we like to call a dummy mander in electoral politics, something that could very really happen if the legislature is forced to draw this map in a way that might actually not see too far in the future. Let's talk about examples in the past that can help you understand what a dummy mander is and why Republicans might be in for that in the 2026 midterms in the state of Texas. The first example that comes to mind dates all the way back to when George H.W. Bush was president and Democrats maintained control of the state delegation in 1990 in the state of Illinois. This is a state that Republicans have had some luck in. George H.W. Bush actually won Illinois in the 1988 election. But again, Democrats were maintaining strong amounts of governance across the state and were largely popular on the House map. And keep in mind, this was in the day and age the Democrats had maintained the House majority for 40 years consistently. So some gerrymandering had to do with that. But what happened here was that by the time you reached the end of the decade, Democrats redrew the map in 1992, hoping to shore up their base, 15-7, But it actually didn't happen. Republicans flipped some seats across the state, and it actually became a bit more difficult to see how Democrats were going to maintain that dominance that they otherwise had. And then it started to bleed. By 1994, Republicans got even with Democrats. By the time you reach 1996, you can see that the simple map here goes from 12 to 8, from 15 to 7, to 12 to 8, to 10 to 10, and it maintains itself. Enough so that the map even provides the opportunity that in Illinois' 17th district, you could have actually seen Republicans maintain the majority or expand the majority in the state of Illinois. And then by 1988, became 10 to 10, and then by the year 2000, it was so bled to a point the Democrats didn't even really see viable pickup opportunities and could only win in the vote sinks that they had drawn for themselves. But keep in mind, this is a map that the Democratic Party drew for themselves to maintain dominance that started at the beginning of the decade of 15 to 7 that ended with a split delegation. Let's look at another example. This is a great one. Arkansas, which is, if you Google dummy mander, this one will come up. If you know anything about Arkansas in electoral history, you will know that Arkansas used to be actually a very strong Democratic state. Bill Clinton was the governor there, won it in both elections by huge margins, and in the 2000 election was decided by less than 10 points in 2000, and then almost that in 2004. In fact, in the 2008 presidential election, when it was Hillary Clinton versus John McCain, or so it seemed, Hillary Clinton was polling ahead of John McCain in Arkansas. And that actually made sense for the time. Arkansas was quite competitive. But Democrats maintained their dominance despite not winning it on the presidential level for quite some time in the state legislature. In the 2008 election, you'll see that Democrats had 3 out of the 4 seats and did so by massive margins, enough that the Republican Party didn't even consider running an opponent in the Arkansas race here. Even though John McCain was winning across the state, they had a Senate race too. The Republicans did not even nominate a candidate. That's how unwinnable it was for the GOP. But then in 2010, everything changed. A lot of the Democrats decided that they weren't going to run, but in the state legislature, Democrats held on to the seats and said, we're going to redraw the map that gives Democrats an advantage. It's going to give them 2 seats for the rest of the decade, and we're going to do it by splitting major cities and putting huge pockets of Democratic vote share in huge rural areas, and Democrats will come out ahead. So they drew the map. The Democratic governor signed it. Republicans objected. They said, this is unfair. But guess what happened the next election? Immediately, Republicans won every single seat. Remember, this map was supposed to give Democrats 2 seats for 10 years. And every single race wasn't just Republican. It was Republican through and through. Districts across the state that previously might have been Democratic were in the immediate had shifted over in favor of the GOP in a way the Democrats weren't able to see a year and a half out. The map was signed in April of 2011, but by November of 2012, the entire map wiped out the Democrats. It took years for Democrats to get closer, and in 2018, it finally happened. French Hill, in this race, got 52.1% of the vote. And by 2020, it was invested in again, went back in favor of the Republican Party. But then Republicans did what they know best, and that is drawing a map in favor of themselves, and they turned what was a dummy mander for Democrats into a very successful gerrymander for Republicans. You're not touching any of these districts. Crawford plus 49, plus 18, plus 46, plus 32, and thus all Democratic hopes in the state went down the drain. And so to just speed run here to show you an example too, 2016, a special master, Republicans actually liked this map. By 2018, you can see that a map that was meant to benefit the Republican Party overwhelmingly ended up benefiting the Democrats. When you take a look at Pennsylvania in 2010, by the end of the decade, you end up with a split delegation. The map itself too also was drawn in such a way that Republicans had to get it struck down. Democrats got it struck down, but you can start to see the bleeding. Plus 9, plus 11, that by the next election, again, it makes sense that a redrawn map already set up Democrats to do quite well. And Texas as a great example to end our note here to show you what a dummy mander looked like for them. In 2010, they drew this map that would sink the Democrats, get them just 12 seats. By 2018, a lot of bleeding that if you had just shifted the map here by just 5 points, Democrats would have been able to win the majority across Texas. And so thinking about what's happening now, Republicans could be in a position where redrawing the map puts them so unfavorable and so split that by the time we reach the end of the decade, the map actually might be more advantageous for Democrats than where it is today. Because American politics is unpredictable. And coming off the last presidential election and the last midterm cycle, Republicans did quite well, especially amongst Latino voters. But assuming that something won't change between now and 2030 is assuming a lot. If Democrats were to look at the 2016 election results and compare it to 2024, it would have seemed unrecognizable that the overall electoral turnout and the electoral performance for Kamala Harris versus Hillary Clinton, you would have expected to be vastly different. But when you take a look, especially across the southern border, of the improvement for Trump in 2024 versus 2016, you would also assume that he must have been dominating across the state enough that he was winning by the margins maybe that George W. Bush was. And even then, when you take a look at 2004 as a great example, the last time Republicans won by over 20 points in the state, you'll see that the map actually looks a little bit more red in 2024, this is 2024, than it does in 2004, even if that isn't the case. And that's because the Republican Party could draw Texas in a way that sure makes sense for the 2024 election. But 2026 won't be like 2024. They have a great map as is. Putting it plainly, the Texas gerrymander is so favorable to the GOP, and it'd be really hard to see how Democrats could do well at all. Even if you shift the map here by 25 points, what do you end up with? Democrats not even at the majority in a 25-point shift. To put that into perspective of what a 25-point shift would look like on the presidential level, rather on the congressional level, this is exactly what would happen. For Texas to get just 2 seats away from Democrats being in the majority, Democrats would already have 305 seats across the country. So forget Texas, lose every seat there, you still have the biggest majority Democrats have held in the nation's recent memory. And so thinking about that, you have to understand that, where you are in Texas and what happens here largely does depend on how Texas does the redraw. But I'm not that confident that they will do it in a way that is overwhelmingly successful that puts them on track for a massive victory in 2026. They might find a way that works just in 2026. But there are many ways this could backfire, whether through California, whether through New York, or whether through their own dummy mander, which we've seen both parties do time and time again. And Texas might just be one of those cases. So it'll be interesting to watch. The special session is soon. We'll find out what's going to happen. And ultimately, this redraw might be more consequential for the Republican Party, just in ways they might not expect. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 House election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.